1934 had been an eventful year for Adolf Hitler, to say the least. After a triumphant first year in office, he was now faced with some of his toughest challenges so far. In June, the issues between the party, the army, and pretty much all of German society with the SA came to a head. Hitler's brown shirts were totally out of control, and from all sides the Fuhrer was being bombarded with demands to deal with them. Many said he was too weak to do so, including his Vice-Chancellor Papen. Hitler proved all of these doubters wrong almost immediately, when on the 30th of June, he dealt with the issue once and for all in the famous Night of the Long Knives. Röhm and the majority of the SA leadership lay dead, as well as dozens of other men around Germany for old grudges, amongst other things. Hitler's involvement in the non-SA killings is heavily disputed, however, and he was furious when he found out about many of them. Another issue arose a month later, when Austrian National Socialists stormed the Chancellery and shot Chancellor Dollfuss dead. Hitler inevitably got the blame, despite having nothing to do with the situation in reality. Hitler, quite understandably, came off as a ruthless dictator, and those in the foreign press who had been slinging mud at Hitler for years were overjoyed to finally have something that seemed real, and the anti-German sentiment abroad went into overdrive. At home was a different story, however, and the German people loved their Fuhrer more than ever before, as they were just happy that the SA problem had been dealt with. They felt those abroad complaining about the situation simply didn't understand the goings-on in Germany. Few other Europeans at the time had experienced anything like the turbulence that Germany had since that fateful day of November the 11th, 1918, when they threw themselves at the mercy of the Allies at the end of the Great War. The German people had been through mutinies, starvations, famines, civil wars, revolts, and revolutions, to name just a few, in just over a decade. The stability that came with the Hitler regime was a breath of fresh air for those who just wanted to live a normal life. Most were more than happy to overlook the more extreme aspects of the NSDAP. When President Hindenburg passed away in August, the German people voted for Hitler to assume his position too, and from that day forth, Adolf Hitler was now officially titled Der Führer und Reichskanzler, the Führer and Chancellor of the Reich. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. This is a video about Adolf Hitler, so obviously, by its very nature, it's going to be controversial. In this video, however, I'll express no opinions of my own, and all quotes will be those of others, so please use common sense. Thank you. Also, this video is part of a larger series on the life of Adolf Hitler. You can easily watch this video on its own, but if you'd like to start from the start, then the playlist is on my channel homepage, and the link will be in the description too. And finally, a huge thank you to my patrons and other supporters who make these videos possible. I have now officially moved away, and I'm full-time on YouTube. This is almost entirely thanks to donations and subscriptions, and I cannot thank you guys enough. Soon, I'll be streaming, among other things, as well as thinking of exclusive benefits for my Patreon, Subscribestar, and YouTube members. If you do enjoy these videos, then please consider signing up in the link in the description to join the Discord, our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, or if you just want to support the channel. Even the $2 tier helps more than you can possibly imagine. Thank you. After the plebiscite regarding Hitler taking the presidency passed, with a resounding 90% in the Führer's favour, he headed off to his mountain retreat for a late summer holiday. He spent most of his time relaxing, or strolling around the grounds, talking to friends, but he also had something else on his mind, the 6th Party Congress rally at Nuremberg. Whilst the Nuremberg rallies were a yearly event that lasted until 1939, this was to be by far the most famous. Another thing that was bothering Hitler, as always, was the foreign press. They were desperate for any information they could find to tear down Hitler's regime, and the new theme seemed to be painting Hitler as some kind of cult leader. An American visitor at the Passion Play in Oberammergau said, quote, "This is not a revolution, it's a revival. They think Hitler is God. Believe it or not, a German woman sat next to me at the Passion Play, and when they hoisted Jesus on the cross, she said, 'There he is. That is our Führer, our Hitler.' And when they paid out the 30 pieces of silver to Judas, she said, 'That is Röhm, who betrayed the leader.'" An entry into American Ambassador William Dodd's diary on the 23rd of August 1934 was very similar. Quote, "When Jesus was tried before the angry Jewish court, a well-dressed German, looking very solemn, said to me, 'He is our Hitler.' Ida Horn, a distant kinswoman of mine, sitting in another part of the hall, told me as we came out together. A woman near me said, as Judas received his 30 pieces of silver, 'That is Röhm.' I suspect half the audience, the German part, considers Hitler as Germany's messiah." Stories like these were published everywhere, and to this day, It is painted as if the German people were under some kind of trance in which they felt Hitler was the second coming of Christ, or that he tricked them all into following him in some way. Needless to say, such a view of Hitler's reign is ridiculous. Hitler was absolutely infuriated by these lies and misrepresentations in the foreign press, and was eager to put on the show of a lifetime at the upcoming rally to set the record straight and show what the NSDAP was really all about in his eyes. Young Alfred Speer, now Hitler's party architect, was made the stage manager for the event. Speer tore down the bleachers at Zeppelin Field and instead erected a massive stone structure 1,300 feet long and 80 feet high. On top of the stadium was a giant eagle within a 100-foot wingspread, and the swastika was flying all over the place. 130 anti-aircraft searchlights were spread around with a range of 25,000 feet. Goering had reluctantly let Hitler borrow these from the Luftwaffe at Hitler's insistence as, quote, "If we use them in such large numbers for a thing like this, other countries will think we're swimming in searchlights," end quote. Hitler's vision for the rally went far beyond the short term, and he wanted a permanent record of the events that would last for all time. He reached out to Leni Riefenstahl, the famous actress and director, and asked her to make a film of the event. At first, she was reluctant, but Hitler offered her full cooperation. Eventually, she accepted, but again got cold feet and ran off to Spain for another project, leaving the Nuremberg Rally in the hands of an associate. When she returned home, the rally was only 2 weeks off, and she had a letter from Rudolf Hess waiting for her. According to Hess, Hitler was shocked that she had delegated the work to someone else, and he wanted her to see him at once. Hitler was not angry, but simply persuasive with her. Quote, "You'll only have to give up 6 days of your life," to which she replied that with the editing, that would take 6 months. "Ah, but you are so young," he insisted. She continued to protest, claiming that she was the last person to produce such a movie, as she didn't even know the difference between the SA and the SS, and she also wasn't even a party member. To Hitler, this was a positive, not a negative. He claimed it would be a fresh approach, and that her lack of knowledge was in fact part of the appeal to the whole thing. To Leni, this made sense, and she finally accepted. She immediately got to work, and all sorts of camera angles were set up from planes, cranes, roller skates, or elevator platforms on the flagpoles. She was given a crew of 120 people, 16 of them being cameramen, and Hitler handed over all he had promised to help her and more, including the city's firefighting equipment. Attendees began to flood into Nuremberg, and a vast tent city had been erected nearby. Everything had been rehearsed to perfection. Every participant had a seat, a number, a designated truck, a designated seat in the truck, and a designated bed in the tent city. Before the main event, over 10,000 people swarmed Hitler's hotel, chanting, "We want our Fuhrer." Eventually, he came out to the balcony, where he was greeted with fanatical cheers from the men, women, and children outside. The Fuhrer looked visibly overcome with emotion and scanned the crowd, in awe of the connection he had built with the German people. That evening, a torchlit demonstration was held outside of his hotel in honor of him, with the bands playing and military marches, whilst the swarms of devoted fans had to be held back from getting too close to the hotel itself. The following morning, Hitler dramatically arrived at the arena, followed by Goering, Goebbels, Hess, Himmler, and a few others. After a rendition of Beethoven's Egmont Overture, Rudolf Hess stepped forward and read out a dedication to the fallen President Hindenburg. Then, he read out the names of those who had died in the 1923 putsch. The typically emotional Hess then went into a deep speech, praising Adolf Hitler for his achievements so far, and tried to explain to the Fuhrer how much he meant to the people. By the time he was done, both Hess and Hitler himself were holding back their tears. Hess then stepped off the stage, where the two warmly embraced, and then the rally was officially off to a start. To cover the entire event would take even longer than Leni's movie, which took her until March the following year to get released. It is almost 2 hours long. The most famous day of the events, however, took place on the 7th of September, when 200,000 party members crowded into Zeppelin Field, the one with all the searchlights. 20,000 flags were visible amongst the huge crowd, with exact precision. Speer recalls, "The floodlit stadium gave the impression of a giant hall, ringed with titanic gleaming white pillars, with an occasional cloud floating surrealistically through the majestic wall of light, like a translucent anemone drifting through the sea." The images of the day went down in history. On September the 10th, the rally ended with a huge parade of Germany's mobile units, with the most modern equipment that they had. The 300,000 strong audience looked on in awe at the first display of military might since the fall of the Kaiser. American journalist William Shirer wrote in his diary at the crowd's reactions, quote, "It is rather something deeply ingrained in all Germans. They acted today like children playing with tin soldiers." The Fuhrer himself, many noticed, was as intoxicated as the crowd. After a long day, Rudolf Hess bid farewell to the Fuhrer in the closing speech, where he shouted at the top of his lungs, quote, "The party is Hitler. Hitler, however, is Germany, just as Germany is Hitler. Heil Hitler! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil Hitler!" The crowd then began to join in with loud screams of Sieg Heil also, and the entire atmosphere was one of intense emotion and love for Hitler. Hitler wasn't done, however, and he went off on an unofficial visit to the massed campsite, where he mingled with the men as if he was one of them, joking and reminiscing on old times. Hitler, later that evening, looked back fondly on an eventful week, and he was overjoyed with how it went. Over the coming days, it appeared as if all Hitler's woes had gone away. No longer did he look stressed about the foreign press issue, or other matters. He walked around beaming with happiness that was visible to all. American Ambassador Dodd said that he had never seen the Fuhrer look so overcome with happiness before in his life. Leni came away from the event with an absolute mass of material to work with. During editing, however, she could not please everyone, and she was bombarded with protests from party leaders, claiming that they hadn't been included, or that the movie didn't feature enough propaganda. Hitler urged her to make a few changes to compromise with the other party members, and the two ended up having a row. Leni insisted that it was her work, and the Fuhrer had promised to let her get on with it. The Fuhrer admitted she was right, and the film was completed without any NSDAP interference at all. She was proved right. The film, which was eventually titled Triumph of the Will, went down as the greatest piece of propaganda the party had ever seen, despite it not even being their work, or even propaganda for that matter. All over the world, the film was praised as one of the most important documentary films ever made. At the 1937 World Exhibition in Paris, Leni won the gold medal. Even after the war, the film would be praised for its incredible production. Safe to say, this would not be the last time Adolf Hitler would reach out for Leni's services. By late 1934, Adolf Hitler was adored all over Germany. Part of his appeal, as unbelievable as it may sound given his appearance, was that he was a bachelor. Eva Braun was still in his life, but he had deliberately kept her out of the public view to keep up appearances. Only those closest to the Fuhrer knew the true extent of their relationship. Other than that, it was just rumours. Eva, as most women would be, was extremely distressed by the state of affairs, and she wanted Hitler all to herself. She hated that women all over the country threw themselves at him, although Hitler, unlike others in his position, such as Mussolini, never once took up these fanatical women on their offers. It was only ever Eva for Adolf Hitler. But to her, she would either not have known this, or not have believed it, and slowly she was beginning to go crazy in her isolation. She was struck down by long spells of depression, feeling that Hitler would never marry her, and that she wasn't all that important to him. Hitler always told her that as the head of the German Reich, he must devote himself to the nation with no family distractions, sort of like the Pope with the Catholic Church. Hitler was also suffering from another issue with women. Alois Hitler, Adolf Hitler's older half-brother, had run away from home when they were younger. Life had eventually taken him to Ireland, where he met a woman named Bridget Dowling. The two relocated to Liverpool, and they had a son together, William Patrick Hitler. In 1914, Alois left for a gambling tour of Europe, where he became stranded when World War I broke out. He did not see William again until 1929, and he remarried without divorcing Bridget. The extremely bitter Bridget and her son went on to cause an endless headache for Hitler for the rest of his life. Bridget was in a bad financial situation, and she turned up in Germany to try to gain some aid from their famous relative. She didn't choose the best strategy, and she simply asked Hitler straight up if he would be willing to, quote, pay something to keep her quiet. She was attempting to blackmail the Fuhrer with false stories if he didn't pay up. Hitler invited the duo to Berchtesgaden, where they were met by Angela, Hitler's sister. She absolutely berated them both for attempting to blackmail Hitler. The Fuhrer did end up giving his nephew some jobs, however, and he stayed in Germany until 1938. First, he was given a job in the bank, then at a car factory, and then as a car salesman. This wasn't enough for William, however, and then he, just like his mother, continued to harass the Fuhrer, threatening him that if his personal circumstances did not improve, then he would sell fake embarrassing stories to the newspapers. Still, Adolf persisted with his nephew and made him an offer. If he gave up his British citizenship, then he could have a high-ranking job, the Fuhrer said. William didn't want to accept this, and he fled the nation, where he then began to write fake stories about Hitler. One claiming that the Fuhrer's paternal grandfather was Jewish. Later, in London, he would write an article titled, "Why I Hate My Uncle." Then, he would go on a speaking tour in the US, spreading lies about Hitler, and was still there when the war broke out, and he too was stranded like his father. He personally appealed to the president, and was eventually allowed to join the US Navy to fight against his uncle. The mother was just as much of a nuisance. In 1939, she wrote a fake story claiming that Adolf Hitler had moved to Liverpool in 1912 to dodge conscription in Austria. Among other strange lies, she claimed that it was her who told him to shave the edges of his moustaches to give him his signature look. By contrast, Hitler did have another nephew, however, who he called his favourite, Aloy's son from his second marriage to a German wife. Heinz Hitler fought on the Eastern Front in World War II and was captured in January 1942. Despite an offer from Hitler to swap Heinz for Stalin's son, Stalin refused as he considered his son a traitor for surrendering, and a month later, Heinz died at the age of 21 in a Soviet prison. A year later, Stalin's son died in captivity too. But all this is another story. Hitler's display of military might at Nuremberg had emboldened him to rearm further in the wake of his deteriorating foreign policy. All Hitler had ever wanted was peace and even friendship with Britain, who Hitler always just referred to as England. Despite how bad things were getting between himself and them, he continued to try to patch things up. He had no designs on France, never mind Britain or her empire, so he saw no reason that they should be hostile. Some in Britain felt the same, especially given the bitter memories of the Great War. Others, however, set about obtaining military unity with France so that they could crush Germany once and for all before they became too powerful. France had already tried to encircle Germany with an alliance of smaller states and were consistently belligerent towards Hitler, and the press in both countries were trying to whip up a crusade against him. For the first step in Hitler's mission to befriend Britain, he invited 4 well-known Brits to a party on the 19th of December and spoke openly to them about his feelings. Another of his main topics of the evening was his time in Landsberg prison, as it had been 10 years to the day since his release. After dinner, Hitler invited the fellow non-smokers to a back room, along with Ribbentrop and some ladies. One of these men was Lord Rothermere and his mistress, Princess Stephanie von Hohenlohe, a half-Jew who had introduced the two in the first place. Rothermere was the founder of the Daily Mail and the Daily Mirror, which is still huge newspapers in the UK today. Rothermere was thoroughly impressed with Hitler, and a few weeks later, the Daily Mail publicly celebrated the victory of the Germans in the Saar, to be united with their mother country. 90% voted to join Germany. Even the Catholic Church urged their flock to do so. 9% voted for the status quo, and only 0.5% voted to join with France. Hitler perhaps couldn't have asked for a better propaganda victory. All over the German-speaking world, there were movements cropping up, grasping to be united with Germany, whether it be in Austria, the Sudetenland, or even Memel in Lithuania. Soon, the governments of these nations could no longer bear the pressure, and the Saar was simply the first domino to fall. In January 1935, the Fuhrer received 2 more guests from Britain. One was Lord Alan of Hertford, who brought a personal message of goodwill from Prime Minister MacDonald, and the other was the Marquis of Lothian, who left so impressed with Hitler's peaceful intentions that he tried to persuade the Foreign Secretary of Hitler's sincerity so that the two nations could finally have friendly relations. It seemed that those who were really pulling the strings in the British Empire were not so interested in getting along with Hitler's dictatorial regime, however. One of the stated reasons for torpedoing relations in the following months was, quote, the unbridled enthusiasm shown by the inhabitants of the Tsar upon Hitler's arrival to help celebrate formal occupation of that contested territory, end quote. The Brits began to publicly condemn Germany's arms program, yet at the same time refused to come to any agreement on limiting their own. In fact, the Brits themselves were far better armed than the Germans, and rearming far faster too. Germany would never even hit its peak military production until 1944, as Hitler had always insisted on not becoming too militarized in order to not upset the civilian population, like had happened during World War I, causing the collapse. In March, Goebbels called a conference at the propaganda ministry where he announced a new decree proclaiming universal military service and the raising of the peacetime army to 300,000 men. Everyone expected it to come, and now it was official. Many, especially in France, were shocked that Germany would brazenly violate the Treaty of Versailles like this, despite their own armament programs back home. But ultimately, there was nothing they could do. The French ambassador rushed to complain to Hitler, but the Fuhrer confidently replied that his only enemy was communism. After some persuasion, he left genuinely believing that Hitler had no designs on France or the British, and that his only determination was to destroy communism. Regardless, the French appealed to the League of Nations. On the 25th of March, the British delegation met Hitler, and he outlined why he had done what he did. He said that he himself had never signed the treaty, and that when the Germans, then Prussia, had violated their treaty with Napoleon to come and rescue the Brits at Waterloo, Wellington did not complain. Later, the topic of a proposed Eastern Pact came up, this time in reference to Lithuania. Hitler replied, quote, "We will have nothing whatever to do with Lithuania. In no circumstances shall we make a pact with a state which stamps upon the German minority in Memel." At that very moment, there was a conspiracy trial going on in Memel against the German minority. The next morning, Hitler was handed the telegram announcing the results. He read the guilty verdict aloud, and began to rant about the Lithuanians and asked what Britain would do if the Treaty of Versailles had ripped off part of her territory and turned it over to a country like Lithuania. What if Englishmen were then tortured and imprisoned merely because they acted like Englishmen? Eventually, he regained his composure and returned to events. In the end, as expected, the League did nothing. The following month, Hitler had lunch in his Munich apartment with Sir Oswald Mosley, who had just left the Labour Party to become the leader of the British Union of Fascists. Mosley recalled that, quote, "His hypnotic manner was entirely absent. Perhaps I was an unsuitable subject. In any case, he made no attempt whatever to produce any effect of that kind. He was simple, and treated me throughout the occasion with a gentle, almost feminine charm." End quote. If it wasn't apparent to Mosley at the time, or later, this was almost certainly due to Hitler not wanting to get in too deep with Mosley. To do so would poison relations further between himself and Britain, and he never really expressed even the remotest interest in working with Mosley anyway. On the 10th of April, Berlin was crowded with people for the wedding between Hermann Goering and Emmy Sonnemann. The occasion was gigantic, and the couple were absolutely flooded with gifts. However, the next day, the whole event was pushed to the background by more pressing concerns. The British, the French, and Mussolini's Italy had teamed up to publicly condemn Germany's rearmament at Stresa. A few weeks later, the Franco-Soviet Pact of Mutual Assistance was signed. It was clear to the Germans once more that the British, but mostly the French, were attempting to encircle him, and this time, Mussolini, who had always opposed Hitler whenever he could, had joined the crusade. The Fuhrer began to panic, and on the 3rd of May, he wrote to Lord Rothermere, wishing that things could be different. Quote, "Such an agreement between England and Germany would represent the weighty influence for peace and common sense of 120 million of the most valuable people in the world. The historically unique colonial aptitude and the naval power of Britain would be combined with that of one of the first military nations in the world." Shortly afterwards, Hitler came out once more with a huge speech directed at the British where he laid out his position once more. As always, he wanted peace, friendship, and even an alliance with the British Empire, which he admired so much. He then made a public offer to sign a non-aggression pact with all of his neighbours bar Lithuania, and that if he was given a fleet just 35% of the size of Britain's, he would pronounce this agreement final and bounding forevermore. Even the London Times came out afterwards, calling his demands, quote, "reasonable, straightforward, and comprehensive." He had suddenly turned foreign public opinion on its head, and now, for the first time, many began to view Germany with a sympathetic eye. In 2 weeks' time, the famous naval conference took place. Captain Arata Oka of Japan informed the Germans that attempting to make a deal with the Brits was near impossible, and that in 1921 his nation had entered with good intentions, but was sadly let down. Quote, "Consequently, we were unprepared when the English quickly drove a wedge between our diplomats and our naval experts, separating them into almost hostile groups." End quote. He gave the Germans one piece of advice: demand the 35% and nothing else. Ribbentrop did just this, and the British were left floored. Any counter-demands were simply met with the 35%. The Germans thought that they had left empty-handed and ruined everything, But the next morning, they were invited to speak to the Brits again at the boardroom of the Admiralty. The Brits did a complete U-turn, and the previous day's hostility suddenly gave way to generosity. They allowed the 35%, and also allowed a 45% ratio for submarines. Ribbentrop then returned to Germany like a war hero returning from a foreign conquest. The French were absolutely seething. The agreement had been made on the anniversary of Waterloo no less, and they sent a note of protest to their so-called ally. The note fell on deaf ears, however, as British public opinion saw Germany's demands as entirely logical. It seemed the only man in opposition was Winston Churchill, who continued to rage about it being dangerous to British security. How exactly, Germany having 35% of Britain's navy, whilst the Brits had the entire French navy also to rely on, was unclear at the time. However, now we know that Winston Churchill was in fact being paid by shadowy groups hostile to Hitler in the city of London and ordered to oppose Germany at every turn. At the time, Churchill was looked at as a confused warmonger, shouting at the clouds by the vast majority of the British people. With the endless international drama unfolding around him, Adolf Hitler had even less time than usual to spend with his dear Eva. Whilst she was simply a piece of the Fuhrer's life, he was her entire life. Hitler said 7 years later to his inner circle, quote, "To me, marriage would have been a disaster. There's a point at which misunderstanding is bound to arise between man and wife. It's when the husband cannot give his wife all the time she feels entitled to demand. I'd have had nothing of marriage but the sullen face of a neglected wife, or else I'd have skimped my duties. The bad side of marriage is that it creates rights. In this case, it's far better to have a mistress. The burden is lightened, and everything is placed on the level of a gift," before adding, "What I've said only applies to men of a higher type, of course." End quote. Back at the time, however, Eva Braun was deep in one of her depressions. Suddenly, on the 18th of February, this depression was lifted as Hitler arrived without warning. Quote, "Yesterday he came quite unexpectedly, and it was a delightful evening. I am so endlessly happy that he loves me so much, and pray that it will always be so." 2 weeks later, however, she wrote, "I am again deathly unhappy. Since I cannot write him, this diary has to be the depository of all my tales of woe." Again a week later she said, "I wish that I were very sick, since I have not heard from him for 8 days. Why doesn't something happen to me? Why do I have to go through all this? I wish that I had never seen him. I am desperate. Now I am buying sleeping pills. At least I will be half dazed and don't have to think about it so much anymore. Why does he torment me like this, and not just put an end to the whole thing?" Then, days later, she would make apologies and excuses for him not contacting her. Then once more, she took it further and wrote to her diary threatening suicide. In May, she said, quote, "If I don't have an answer by 10 tonight, I will simply take my 25 pills and gently slumber to the other side." And a few hours later, followed it up with, "Dear God, I am so afraid he won't answer today. If only someone would help me. Everything is so terribly hopeless. Perhaps my letter reached him at an inopportune time. Perhaps I shouldn't have written at all. Whatever the case, this uncertainty is harder to bear than a sudden end. Dear God, please help me so that I can today speak with him. Tomorrow will be too late." End quote. What she did not know was that at this exact time, Hitler was undergoing a throat operation, as for months he was being troubled by an unending sore throat caused by years of high-energy speeches. He was terrified of getting throat cancer, and often compared himself to Emperor Frederick III, who had died of the same cause. In the end, the operation was a success. In the early hours of the 29th of May, however, Eva followed 20 tablets of Vanaform and was found in a coma by her sister, Ilse. Ilse gave her first aid treatment and called for a doctor, whom she trusted to keep things quiet. She took the pages from Eva's notebook to save the family the embarrassment, and to make sure that Hitler didn't end things with Eva because she was so mentally unstable. The doctor wrote that she had a case of excessive fatigue, resulting in an overdose of narcotics. Hitler, refusing to trust Dr. Marx, a Jew, guessed that it was something more sinister instead, and in the end, Eva got her wish. Hitler found her and her younger sister a 3-room apartment, a short walk from Hitler's Munich apartment. He paid the rent himself via his photographer and furnished the place for her. Still, Hitler didn't find that much time for her, visiting her only occasionally in the late hours, whilst the stairs were guarded by the secret police. On one occasion, Fritz Braun, Eva's father, wrote to Hitler begging him to, quote, "return Eva to the bosom of her family." The letter never got to him and was handed over to Ava instead by Hoffmann, Hitler's photographer. Her mother sent one too, and that as well never reached the Fuhrer, or was never answered. It was now September 1935, time for the next Nuremberg Rally. At first, it seemed mild, and the rally went down fairly well around Europe. On the 15th of September, however, the Nuremberg laws were announced. Marriages between Jews and Germans, or Germanics in general, were now banned and made totally illegal. Jews were forbidden to display the German flag, and instead were only to display the Jewish colours. Sexual relations between Jews and Germanics were also forbidden, amongst other things. Luckily for Hitler, the international scandal over these new measures were completely overshadowed by the leader who perhaps disliked Hitler more than any other, Benito Mussolini. On October the 3rd, Italy marched into Ethiopia. Britain, who Mussolini had tried to jump into bed with to oppose Hitler, immediately ran to the forefront to oppose the invasion at the League of Nations, and economic sanctions were quickly put in place. Why Britain, with the largest colonial empire in world history, cared so much about Mussolini invading Ethiopia, a state that still utilized slavery, is unknown, but regardless, Hitler was overjoyed. Mussolini had sabotaged his own scheme against Hitler, and the Fuhrer leapt on the opportunity. He knew that there was no way the Ethiopians could ever hope to prevail against a modern state. However, he could prolong the war if he sent them weapons, which he duly did. This was all done secretly, however, and in public he acted cordially and supported Mussolini as he had always done for over a decade now. As time passed, the international situation became clear. The Brits would do nothing except economic sanctions. All they'd managed to do was sabotage their own relations with Italy over a nation they didn't really even care about. To Hitler, the message was obvious. He could gamble, and the Brits would most likely do nothing of consequence. On the 3rd of January, Adolf Hitler stepped before his Gauleiters, aka district leaders, at a conference and made a rousing speech. He told them that they must all be a single community, loyal to him. He then demanded total devotion, which led to massive applause from the audience. The eternally loyal Hess assured Hitler that all in the room would follow him wherever he went, unquestioningly. The Fuhrer was reassured, and he was ready to take his next step. He set about rectifying that great embarrassment in the West, the Rhineland. The Rhineland, which was all German territory west of the River Rhine, had been occupied by France. The French had been less than benevolent during their occupation. In 1923, they marched across the river into the Ruhr and occupied this region too, the most important industrial area in the entire Reich. All throughout the occupation, they had also used Senegalese or Moroccan troops, which were well known for their brutality, especially towards women. Thousands were raped, and hundreds of mixed-race children were born by those unable to bring themselves to have abortions. All over Germany, newspapers reported on the, quote, Black Horror on the Rhine. Whilst the occupation ended in 1930, the area west of the Rhine was still demilitarized, and the locals felt horribly unsafe in case anything of the sort ever happened again. Besides, they felt, should their own soldiers not be allowed on their own territory? Prime Minister Lloyd George of the Paris Peace Conferences of 1919 had tried hard and been mostly responsible in getting the French down from an annexation to just an occupation, and years later he said, quote, Provocative incidents are the inevitable consequence of any occupation of territory by foreign troops. The irritating and occasionally odious accompaniments of such an occupation of German towns by troops, some of whom were coloured, had much to do with the outbreak of patriotic sentiment in Germany, which finds its expression in Nazism. Lloyd George would go on to meet with and lavish praise on Hitler in September of this year. Another move emboldened Hitler further. On the 20th of January, King George V of Great Britain passed away, and his son, Edward VIII, took his place. Edward was publicly sympathetic to Hitler's Germany, and reaffirmed as much privately shortly after becoming king, when he told an American diplomat that he, quote, disapproved of France's efforts to revive the Entente Cordiale and to hitch Britain to the French wagon. He further deprecated the French desire to force Germany to her knees, and declared that he had much sympathy for Germany's difficult position, end quote. The Duke of Coburg was personally reassured by Edward's loyalty to Germany, quote, To my question whether the discussion between Prime Minister Baldwin and Adolf Hitler would be desirable for future Anglo-German relations, he replied in the following words, Who is king here, Baldwin or I? I myself wish to talk to Hitler, and will do so here, or in Germany. Tell him that, please. End quote. Hitler began to think about how to go about reclaiming the Rhineland. He spoke to his advisors, the army, and others about how to go about it, and if he even should. One idea was to approach Mussolini. Now that a wedge had been driven between Mussolini and the West, he felt he might get a more sympathetic ear from the Duce. Had France not broken the Locarno obligations by including Russia with their Mutual Assistance Pact? Perhaps Mussolini should publicly denounce the pact, he thought, and then he would do the same. Word came back from Mussolini, and he agreed that he didn't like the Franco-Soviet pact, but claimed that it didn't affect Italy directly. Regardless, Hitler took this as indifference and proceeded ahead. On March the 2nd, General von Blomberg gave orders to the chiefs of the three branches of the armed forces to transfer units west. Hitler began to lose his nerve and vacillated between calling the whole thing off or carrying on. The French were getting nervous and were telling Britain that they wished to march into the Rhineland themselves first. Foreign Secretary Eden reported in his memoirs, quote, "To the British people, this was a much more doubtful cause. There was not one man in 1,000 in the country at the time prepared to take physical action with France against a German occupation of the Rhineland." End quote. To Hitler, this was fairly clear, and it was the French, not the Brits, he was worried about, and he barely slept at night. He said later to Hoffmann, quote, "I asked myself the same question. What will France do? Will she oppose the advance of my handful of battalions? I know what I would have done. If I'd have been the French, I should have struck, and I would not have allowed a single German soldier to cross the Rhine." End quote. The day before the big day, leading German journalists were invited to a conference by Goebbels, so secret that they were actually to be held in custody until the following morning. Early on Saturday, the journalists were taken to a Junkers transport plane, and when it took off, they still did not know where they were going. Even the pilot didn't know. At a specific time, he was to open an envelope informing him of his destination. At 10 a.m., the German ambassador to the UK called on Foreign Secretary Eden, quote, "I have a communication of very great importance to make. I am afraid that the first part of it will not be to your taste, but the later portions contain an offer of greater importance than has been made at any time in recent history." End quote. He claimed that France had violated the Treaty of Locarno by making the Franco-Soviet pact. As a result, he said, Germany was well within her rights to reclaim the Rhineland for her own defense. He then announced that Hitler was happy to sign the non-aggression pacts, as mentioned previously, and that he was also willing to re-enter the League of Nations without any conditions. Eden himself was deeply upset about the Rhineland move, and immediately summoned the French ambassador. It was a Saturday, however, and most of the British cabinet, all upper-class aristocratic types, were offered their country homes until Monday. Hitler had deliberately chosen the Saturday for this precise reason. By Monday, the emotions would have died down, and the deed would be done. At 11:30, the press plane landed at Cologne, where thousands of patriotic supporters swarmed the Hohenzollern Bridge across the Rhine. Here, 18 years prior, the German soldiers had left, never to return since, leaving their guns behind them. Now, the crowd could begin to hear the German army once more, this time from the east. As the first soldiers moved onto the bridge, the crowd went absolutely wild. On at least 5 other bridges, units crossed too, and planes were heard overhead. Back at the Kroll Opera House, the temporary seat of the Reichstag, Hitler was met with tremendous applause before making a speech, going over the Treaty of Versailles and why he had made this move. Although he understandably looked nervous, passing his handkerchief from hand to hand, he continued on, ending with, quote, "At this moment, German troops are marching." The crowd went crazier with emotion than the Reichstag had ever heard before during Hitler's reign. The truth, however, was that if any French resistance was met, the men were under orders to stage a fighting withdrawal. Hitler was taking the biggest gamble of his career, but this time, the Allies sat helplessly and did nothing. At the beginning of 1936, Hitler stood in a very different position to that of a couple years prior. He had tested the international waters and found the truth. Britain and France were not united in any real sense, and unless the two of them agreed on something, no action would be taken. Hitler had originally planned to take the Rhineland in 1937, but with the collapse of the Stresa front and the isolation of Mussolini, the opportune moment appeared to be a year earlier. Hitler's Germany had shown that all their talk of restoring Germany to the once proud nation wasn't just talk, they meant it. The Brits had conceded on the navy question, the army had been tripled in size, the Luftwaffe was now officially an armed force. Essentially, the Treaty of Versailles had been thrown in the dustbin of history. As a result, the following year's Nuremberg Rally was named the Rally of Honor, to show that Germany had once more restored her pride and was no longer at the mercy of the Allies. Hitler's newfound knowledge that he could gamble with the Allies was to set a dangerous precedent, however. No gambler can take chances forever and always come out on top. The first domino had fallen, but how many more would before Germany's luck ran out? Thank you very much for watching. As regular viewers will know, I have now moved and I'm officially full-time on YouTube. There may be a little turbulence over the next week or so as I sort things out in my new location, but after that, it's officially smooth sailing, and you can expect consistent, high-quality content. Thank you so much for the support so far in this journey, and I'm looking forward to what's to come. The biggest thanks of all, as always, goes to my patrons, subscribe stars, and YouTube members who keep me afloat and able to feed my family whilst doing this for a living. If you enjoy these videos and you'd like to join our weekly Hearts of Iron 4 games, join the Discord, or just want to support me while I get this channel off the ground, then please do consider signing up in the links in the description. Even the $2 tier helps more than you can possibly imagine. Thank you to Lobster to You, Darway Lolalol, Sigmar, Emperor Titus, Luke David Murphy, Chechen Natsok, Anton Berglund, Levi E, Friendly Brian, Mr. Malabar, Bushak, Firefly Enterprise, Henry Unruh, Evan Brightfield, Chef Jeff, Ethan Winstanley, Wunderwaffe, Mr. Bloom, Gav D, Gaius Longanese Hanno, JD, Green Rebel, Angus Roxburgh, Rocksaka Too Heavy, Alexios Podcast Watcher, Citadel, Haste, Bojan M, Rick Me, Eric 235628, and The Waller.